The HOA butchered my family's 100-year-old oak tree in half while I was standing over my father's grave. They thought they were proving a point. Instead, their stunt backfired in ways no one in this neighborhood could have imagined. That tree, the same one my great-grandfather pressed into the dirt with his own hands in 1923, had been the backdrop to 4 generations of family history. Birthdays, weddings, graduations, all of it happened under those sprawling branches. On the day I was laying my dad to rest, the president of our HOA decided it was the perfect opportunity to unleash a crew with chainsaws and slice the tree straight down the middle, as if she were splitting a log for kindling. That evening, numb from grief, I pulled into my driveway. And there she was, Christine Cartwright. Polished. Perfect. Clipboard clutched to her chest like it contained state secrets. Her lips curled into a satisfied little smirk while she directed a cleanup crew around the wreckage of my family's legacy. The sight stopped me in my tracks. Half of the oak still stood, the other half lay butchered on the ground. It looked surreal, like a sword had cut through nature itself. Here's the funny thing about destroying something beautiful out of spite: sometimes, it only makes the world see just how ugly you really are. Imagine this: you've just buried your father, and you return home to find the one thing connecting you to your family's past split down the middle. What would you do? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and whether your HOA has ever pulled something even remotely this insane. But before I dive deeper into how this spiraled into war, let me properly introduce myself. My name's Derek Holbrook. I'm 52 years old, an electrician by trade, and the 3rd generation of my family to live in this house. My grandmother bought the property back when this whole area was nothing but cotton fields and dirt roads. The house itself is a 1947 Craftsman, wide porches, built-in shelves, sturdy bones, and the kind of charm that developers will never be able to replicate with stucco and beige paint. Every morning, sunlight used to filter through the oak's branches and spill across the kitchen table. The place always smelled like sawdust and strong coffee, scents so deeply embedded into the walls that they'd become part of the house's soul. And then there was that oak, right outside my window. My great-grandfather planted it in 1923, the year he came home from the trenches of France. He said after witnessing so much horror overseas, he needed to put something beautiful in the ground, something meant to last. That tree became the anchor of our family's story. Every milestone, every memory, it all happened under its shade. My first stumbling steps across the yard. Graduation photos in a cap and gown. My wedding picture, back when I still believed forever actually meant forever. Later, when my dad got sick, he'd sit beneath that oak every morning, clutching his coffee cup, watching the sunrise through its leaves. I watched cancer eat away at the strongest man I'd ever known for 2 long months. 3 weeks before his diagnosis, divorce papers landed on my table. My wife apparently hadn't meant those vows about sickness and health. By the time my marriage collapsed, that tree and that house weren't just property anymore. They were all I had left, the last threads tying me to everything I'd grown up believing mattered. That's when the developers showed up. This land used to be nothing but open fields. Then about 15 years ago, developers swooped in, carving up the farmland and slapping down oversized houses like they were playing a board game. They named the neighborhood Willowbrook Estates. Because nothing screams, classy suburb, like naming it after trees you bulldoze to build it. Around my grandmother's modest little home, McMansions sprouted like weeds. Beige, massive, cookie-cutter boxes with 3-car garages and fake stone facades. My old Craftsman stuck out like a sore thumb. And of course, once the houses were up, they decided the neighborhood needed an HOA. The justification? Protecting property values. Now, technically, my house was grandfathered in. Compliance was voluntary. Which is like saying a root canal is voluntary. Sure, you can skip it, if you enjoy screaming in pain. And at the center of this circus was Christine Cartwright. Christine moved in from California about 6 years ago. Within months, she had launched herself into HOA politics with the enthusiasm of someone campaigning for world domination. Naturally, she won the presidency. She was a real estate agent, no surprise there, and she lived in the largest house on the cul-de-sac. 4,800 square feet of beige perfection, right down to a doormat that probably had an Ivy League pedigree. She carried her clipboard everywhere. The sharp click of her manicured nails tapping against it became the neighborhood's unofficial alarm system. At first, the harassment came dressed as formality. Instead of love letters, I got HOA notices typed up on official letterhead. My grass, apparently, was a quarter-inch too tall. My mailbox? The wrong shade of black. Did you know there's a difference between midnight black and obsidian black? Christine did. My work truck violated some commercial vehicle clause buried in the handbook so deep it could have been hiding with Jimmy Hoffa. But none of that compared to her fixation on the oak tree. She claimed its branches reached 2 inches, yes, 2 inches, into my neighbor's airspace. She acted like we were negotiating international borders, not suburban property lines. I'd already had a certified arborist trim it 6 months earlier. But that wasn't enough for Christine. She marched over herself, tape measure in hand, treating the tree like a crime scene. She snapped pictures from 17 different angles, documenting evidence like she was building a case for court. And that's how Christine operated. Every inch of that tree, every branch, every shadow, became her obsession. The morning of my father's funeral, I left before dawn. The service was 2 hours away. I handed my spare key to Mrs. Olivia, my neighbor. She's 83 years old, sharper than most people half her age, and the unofficial neighborhood watched long before Ring cameras existed. The funeral was exactly what you'd expect. A stranger recited hollow words about my father's long life, while my brother and I sat stiff in rented suits that smelled like mothballs, trying not to fall apart. By the time I returned home, the desert sun was sinking low, painting everything gold. My tires crunched on gravel, and the sound felt unnaturally loud in the quiet evening air. Then I saw it. The tree. The oak that had stood through wars, depressions, storms, and 4 generations of Holbrooks. Cut clean in half, standing there like some grotesque sculpture. Not trimmed. Not removed. Just split down the middle, as if Mother Nature herself had lost her mind. And there she was. Christine, pristine as ever, blazer spotless, directing a cleanup crew like she was orchestrating a Broadway show. The air reeked of fresh sawdust mixed with diesel exhaust. She waved a piece of paper at me, an emergency work order, and announced it had been necessary for neighborhood safety. I just stood there, in my funeral clothes, staring at the mangled remains of my family tree. Neighbors gathered nearby, whispering and gawking as if it were a car wreck. Christine beamed like she'd just cured cancer, holding that paper high as though it were the Constitution itself. 3 neighbors complained about dangerous widowmaker branches, she declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. The HOA has emergency powers to act in the interest of community safety. Emergency powers. Sure. And I'm the Easter Bunny. I demanded to see the complaints. She clutched her tablet like it contained nuclear launch codes. Privacy concerns, she chirped. But Christine couldn't resist bragging. She had photos with timestamps, measurements down to the millimeter, contractor estimates, the whole forensic package. She'd turned tree cutting into a criminal investigation. This tree was trimmed 6 months ago, I said, pulling out my phone. I had the arborist certification saved. Licensed, bonded, all of it. She laughed. Not a polite chuckle. A full-throated cackle that sounded like she gargled gravel. That's adorable, Derek. Sue us. The HOA's legal fund could buy your little house twice over. But while she gloated, something strange happened. Neighbors started pulling out their phones. Not to record Christine, but to snap pictures of the tree. Half standing, half butchered, it looked like surreal art. By the time the sun set, photos of my destroyed oak were spreading across social media faster than gossip at a church potluck. That night, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the half-destroyed silhouette outside my window. Sawdust still clung to the air like smoke after a fire. The scene felt unreal, like I'd slipped into some twisted dream. But my dad had been a union electrician. He drilled one lesson into me growing up: knowledge is the only tool management can't confiscate. So while Christine likely slept soundly in her oversized beige palace, I was hunched over my laptop, eyes burning as I dove into HOA law. What I found kept me going, even as the coffee turned bitter on my tongue. HOA, emergency powers, weren't the magic wand Christine liked to wave around. By law, they could only bypass standard procedures if there was an immediate threat to life or property. Not, maybe dangerous branches. Not, neighbors don't like how it looks. Immediate, as in, someone will die in the next 10 minutes if nothing is done. Otherwise, they were bound by notification requirements, 72 hours written notice, documented assessments, approval timelines. Christine couldn't just wake up one morning and declare war on my tree. And yet, that's exactly what she'd done. The next morning, I called the HOA's lawyer. Straight to voicemail. I tried again. More voicemail. Apparently, emergency powers didn't extend to answering calls from the people you just screwed over. That's when Mrs. Olivia appeared on my porch, holding a mug of tea in one hand and a USB drive in the other. I saw her, she said matter-of-factly. 7 o'clock in the morning, the day of your father's funeral. Tape measure in hand. She was out there circling that tree like a burglar casing a bank. I blinked at her, too tired to react. And I've got the footage to prove it, she added, passing me the drive like it was a bar of gold. Mrs. Olivia's house had more cameras than a casino. After porch pirates made off with her arthritis medication one too many times, she invested in a professional security system. The footage she handed me was crystal clear. Timestamp, 7:03 a.m. There was Christine, standing at the base of my oak tree, tape measure stretched out like she was examining evidence at a crime scene. Timestamp, 2:17 p.m. Christine filed her emergency work order. Timestamp, 11:30 a.m. Chainsaws fired up. The math was laughable. You can't file emergency paperwork after you've already begun the emergency work. Mrs. Olivia shook her head. That woman planned this like D-Day. Took pictures from every angle. Wrote it all down like she was preparing testimony. I stared at the footage until my eyes burned. She wasn't protecting the neighborhood. She wasn't responding to danger. She'd orchestrated the whole thing, down to the minute. And the internet was eating it up. Car doors slammed outside every hour as people showed up to see the art tree. What Christine had meant as destruction was turning into a spectacle. Professional photographers lugged tripods out of their trunks. Tourists posed in front of the splintered trunk like it was modern art. Coffee shops were already advertising half-tree lattes and surreal Sunday specials. By the end of the week, the local paper ran a feature, Accidental Suburban Art Installation Draws Crowds. Christine, of course, doubled down. This proves how dangerous it was, she announced to a group of reporters, gesturing toward the crowds of people snapping photos. Look at all these visitors. It's clearly a distraction hazard, a liability nightmare. That tree must come down completely. Her logic was something to behold. The more people admired it, the more dangerous it became. By that reasoning, the Grand Canyon should have been filled in years ago. Meanwhile, I kept digging. HOA emergency powers, environmental clauses, financial procedures. The more I read, the clearer it became that Christine had cut corners, violated timelines, and flat-out broken the law. Emergency expenditures above $500, for example, required board approval and competitive bids. Always. No exceptions. Christine's little stunt had cost $3,200. And the landscaping company? Owned by her brother-in-law. The realization hit me like a jolt of electricity. This wasn't just about pettiness. This was about money. Mrs. Olivia confirmed it later that week. She'd done some snooping of her own, she had a talent for it. Guess who signed that $3,200 check, she said, waving printed financial records like she'd discovered buried treasure. Christine. No bids. No board approval. Straight into her brother-in-law's pocket. I stared at the paper in disbelief. That's not just a violation. That's theft. She nodded, her eyes gleaming. Call it what it is, Derek. Embezzlement. But Christine wasn't finished trying to bury me. 3 days later, I opened my mailbox to find a thick envelope stuffed with legal threats. A cease and desist letter from the HOA attorney, accusing me of harassment and defamation of character. The irony nearly knocked me over. Christine, who had butchered my tree while I buried my father, now claimed I was harassing her. The letter rattled off a list of supposed violations. My work truck. My mailbox. Even my garage projects. Each carried fines that grew daily, designed to nickel-and-dime me into submission. But the brilliance of Christine's plan ran smack into reality. The tree was attracting more attention by the day. Tour buses idled on our street, pumping out diesel fumes as crowds poured out with cameras. The Henderson kids set up a lemonade stand and made a small fortune. Mrs. Peterson down the street started charging tourists $5 to use her bathroom. Even the neighborhood teenagers, usually allergic to effort, were selling bottled water at highway robbery prices. Christine's response? She called code enforcement. Mr. Holbrook, the officer said, consulting his clipboard with an air of forced politeness. You're operating an unauthorized commercial enterprise. I laughed. I haven't charged a dime. People just show up with cameras. He shrugged. Doesn't matter. You need to discourage them or face zoning violations. Before I could answer, Mrs. Olivia appeared like a guardian angel. Ask him about the contracts, she said sweetly. Ask him why his brother-in-law got paid $3,200 without board approval. The officer blinked. Excuse me. I handed over the financial records Olivia had uncovered. His face tightened. I see. Well, I'll need to file a report. Christine's empire of control was beginning to crack. The internet kept the pressure on. Photos of the half-tree spread like wildfire. Memes popped up comparing it to Salvador Dali paintings. Influencers staged photo shoots in front of it. The HOA board's inbox was flooded with complaints, not about me, but about Christine. The more she tried to frame the tree as a hazard, the more people rallied around it as art. And that's when I realized, Christine thought she was teaching me a lesson about compliance. Instead, she was showing everyone exactly what happens when a petty tyrant thinks no one is watching. This wasn't just about a tree anymore. This was war. The following week was a blur of lawyers' voicemails, angry notices, and the ever-present hum of strangers' cameras outside my house. Christine had poked a hornet's nest, but instead of backing down, she leaned in harder. That Monday morning, my mailbox delivered another gift, a fresh stack of violation notices. My work truck, still illegal. My mailbox, still the wrong shade of black. Even my weekend projects in the garage were now labeled noise disturbances. Each violation carried daily escalating fines, piling up like a slot machine that only took and never paid out. But Christine's timing couldn't have been worse. By now, my mutilated oak wasn't just a neighborhood spectacle, it had become county famous. Tour buses lined the street every weekend. Coffee shops advertised drinks named after the tree. Local photographers were booking sessions in front of it. The more Christine screamed, "Hazard," the more people showed up to admire what she had done. Mrs. Peterson was raking in cash charging tourists for bathroom access. The Henderson kids' lemonade stand had expanded into selling snacks, merch, even bottled water with labels that read, "Oak Juice." A couple of teenagers made more in a weekend selling half-tree selfie stickers than I made in a week running wire. Christine, of course, called code enforcement again. "This is an unauthorized commercial venture," the officer recited, clipboard in hand. His tone made it sound like he didn't believe his own words. I held my palms up. "I'm not selling anything. People just show up." He opened his mouth to respond, but Mrs. Olivia cut him off. She stepped onto my porch holding her ever-present folder of evidence. "Why don't you ask about the contract?" she said, her voice deceptively sweet. "Ask why $3,200 was paid to the HOA president's brother-in-law without competitive bids or board approval." The officer froze. His pen stopped moving. $3,200. I handed him a copy of the financial records Olivia had unearthed. His expression darkened. "I'll need to look into this," he muttered. And just like that, another crack appeared in Christine's carefully constructed facade. But the harassment didn't stop. Anonymous notes began appearing around my property. Scrawled on cheap, scratchy dollar store paper in blocky handwriting, they carried messages that sounded like a middle schooler trying to write threats. "Drop the lawsuit or things get worse. Trees aren't the only things that get cut down. Smart men know when to quit." I found them tucked under windshield wipers, shoved through my mail slot, even taped to my front door. Each one was laughably transparent, but they piled up like an itch I couldn't scratch. Whoever wrote them wasn't clever. They were desperate. Meanwhile, Christine had decided her next move was public relations. Channel 7 ran a segment titled HOA Overreach, When Tree Trimming Goes Too Far. The reporter asked Christine on camera why emergency powers were necessary on the very day of my father's funeral. Christine, dressed in her sharpest power blazer, looked straight into the camera and said, "It was an unfortunate coincidence. Safety priorities supersede personal scheduling conflicts." Personal scheduling conflicts. She had just described my father's funeral that way, on live television. When I replayed the clip online that night, I felt the shift. For months, I'd been the grieving electrician fighting a clipboard tyrant. Now Christine had outed herself for what she really was, a bureaucrat so wrapped in her own authority that she couldn't hear her own cruelty. The internet lit up. Comment sections exploded. Memes of Christine's smirk paired with captions like, "Safety first, funerals later," spread across social media. Strangers who had never met me or seen my tree were suddenly invested in the story of one man versus his HOA president. And Christine, in her infinite wisdom, decided to escalate again. 3 days later, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. Not the usual sparsely attended gathering about garbage bin placement. This was a full-blown session, complete with notices, sign-in sheets, and a rented projector. The agenda? Declare my half-tree a public nuisance and authorize complete removal. The community center where the meeting was held looked as lifeless as always, beige walls, flickering fluorescent lights, folding chairs that squeaked like they were protesting their own existence. The smell of industrial disinfectant hung heavy in the air, masking decades of spilled coffee and broken dreams. Christine strutted to the front of the room, her posture straight as if she were presiding over a courtroom. She had her case laid out like a prosecutor, enlarged photos of tourists crowding around the tree, charts claiming property values were declining, testimony lined up from a landscaper she'd brought in. "This tree has become a circus," she declared, gesturing dramatically at the photos. "Property values are suffering. Children cannot play safely in their own yards. Something must be done." The landscaper she hired, a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, shuffled nervously to the podium. He mumbled about structural instability, liability risks, and the tree being compromised. He had PowerPoint slides, charts, even a laser pointer. Never mind that my certified arborist had already submitted a professional report declaring the tree safe. This man had a tie and a slideshow, which apparently made him more credible in Christine's eyes. But I had come prepared too. That very morning, I'd driven to the county courthouse and dug through dusty archives until I found what I needed, the original property deed from 1947. And inside it? A golden nugget, an environmental protection clause requiring the preservation of significant mature trees. Not just any tree. Specifically my oak tree, mentioned by name as a heritage specimen, protected in perpetuity. That word, perpetuity, hit me like a gift from the past. Legalese for forever. Jake Morrison, my attorney, drove in from Phoenix with copies of the deed and a briefcase stuffed with legal precedents. Jake wasn't flashy, but he carried the quiet authority of a man who'd buried opponents under stacks of motions. He looked every bit like the kind of lawyer who enjoyed watching opposing counsel sweat. When Christine finished her grand speech, Jake stood up. His voice carried across the room with calm confidence. Before this board proceeds to vote, he said, I'd like to submit some documentation. He laid the property deed on the table like a magician revealing his ace of spades. This tree is protected under the original environmental covenant attached to this property. Any removal requires permits, environmental impact studies, and approval from the Historical Preservation Committee. The room went dead silent. You could hear the fluorescent bulbs buzzing overhead. Christine's face flushed, drained, then flushed again, cycling through colors like a broken traffic light. Jake didn't stop there. Furthermore, the so-called emergency work performed on this tree was done without proper permits. That constitutes a violation of both city ordinances and state environmental laws. The contractor could face criminal charges for destruction of protected flora. Suddenly, Christine's landscaper expert found his shoes fascinating. The actual contractor, sitting 3 rows back, shifted uncomfortably, looking like he wished he'd called in sick. Jake pressed on. And finally, the HOA violated its own bylaws by awarding a no-bid $3,200 contract to a relative of the HOA president without board approval. That isn't just a procedural violation. That's potential embezzlement under state law. The silence stretched like taffy until someone in the back started clapping. Slowly at first, then louder. Within seconds, half the room joined in. Christine sat frozen, her smirk gone, as the tide turned right before her eyes. The board postponed the vote indefinitely. 3 members quietly resigned during the recess. Christine, for the first time since I'd known her, looked like someone who'd lost control. But the true turning point came a few days later, when Jake's forensic accountant finished combing through the HOA's financial records. Derek, Jake said over the phone, his voice carrying the same energy as a man who'd just discovered buried treasure. You might want to sit down. What is it? Your tree wasn't about spite. It was about covering tracks. The HOA insurance company flagged your oak during a policy review. Any damage to a protected tree could trigger a liability investigation. Christine needed it gone before the audit uncovered her, let's call them creative financial practices. He paused. We're not just talking one no-bid contract. We're talking a pattern. Nearly $50,000 in HOA funds siphoned to companies owned by her relatives. Landscaping, fencing, consulting firms that barely exist. This wasn't incompetence. This was embezzlement. I let out a low whistle. Suddenly everything clicked. The harassment. The nitpicking over mailbox colors and lawn height. The desperate attempt to destroy my oak. She wasn't trying to enforce rules. She was trying to drive me out before I discovered the environmental protections written into my deed. Christine's tree stunt wasn't about compliance. It was about eliminating evidence. The more Christine's world cracked, the harder she scrambled to plaster over the fractures. But instead of repairing anything, every desperate move she made only widened the damage. It began with whispers. At my job sites, rumors spread like wildfire. Anonymous complaints landed on inspectors' desks claiming my electrical work wasn't up to code. Safety checks popped up at every project, each one conveniently following a heated exchange with the HOA. The pattern was too precise to ignore. Christine wanted to bleed me out with inconvenience. Clients started asking questions. Was I distracted? Had grief made me sloppy? I knew it wasn't them speaking, it was Christine's poison filtering through the grapevine. Even my neighbors changed. People who used to wave when I drove by suddenly discovered an urgent fascination with their flower beds. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had dropped casseroles at my door during Dad's illness, now turned away, muttering excuses about being busy. Christine's narrative was working. The notes escalated too. Same scratchy paper. Same block letters. More vicious now. Drop it or lose more than a tree. Quit before you end up like him. Accidents happen in neighborhoods like this. I didn't know whether to laugh or rage. It was all so cartoonish, like a villain out of a bad movie. But paper threats have a way of crawling under your skin, no matter how ridiculous they look. Christine's piece de resistance, though, came when Channel 7 circled back with a follow-up segment. The story was gaining traction statewide. HOA Horror Story was their headline. They invited Christine back, and, never one to refuse a spotlight, she showed up wearing another power blazer, crocodile tears already loaded. On camera, she painted herself as the real victim. I've been receiving death threats, she sniffled. This man has turned the community against me. I was only trying to protect property values and safety. Now my family fears for our lives. The performance was laughable, but it played to an audience who didn't know the details. The clip went viral. But investigative reporters aren't fools. They're bloodhounds. Once they catch a scent, they dig until they hit bone. Within days, Channel 7 dropped a bombshell, a deep dive exposing Christine's pattern of targeting homeowners who challenged her. Families had been driven out. Elderly residents had been fined for violations that didn't even exist in the handbook. Veterans cited for flying flags that were too large. Wheelchair ramps labeled unsightly additions. Christine wasn't protecting the neighborhood. She was terrorizing it. The newspaper piled on with a scathing editorial about HOA corruption, using Christine as Exhibit A for everything broken in suburban governance. When unelected officials believe they are above the law, the columnist wrote, homeowners become prisoners in their own communities. Christine's reputation crumbled. But she wasn't finished. The insurance company had quietly launched their own investigation. And what they found was dynamite. Years of fraudulent claims. Inflated landscaping invoices. Fake storm damage reports. Even a conveniently stolen equipment list that mysteriously reappeared after a payout cleared. Christine's family businesses had been milking insurance policies like cash cows. Then came the knock on her door one Thursday morning. Not from me. Not from a neighbor. But from the FBI. Federal agents in suits and sunglasses walked up her manicured driveway carrying search warrants. Christine had crossed a line without realizing it. Mail fraud. Insurance fraud. Racketeering. When you use the postal system to funnel fake claims, suddenly your little HOA scheme becomes federal. I watched from my porch as she opened her door, face pale, eyes wide. The cameras caught it all, neighbors recording from across the street, phones raised like torches. The FBI marched out carrying boxes of documents, computers, hard drives. Christine's carefully crafted image of control collapsed under the weight of actual authority. That evening, I sat under the half-tree, beer in hand, watching the sunset bleed through its scarred branches. The neighborhood hummed with whispers. Christine's perfect empire was caving in. And still, she wasn't done. Her next move was pure desperation. The HOA board, gutted by resignations, met for an emergency session. Christine announced, with a straight face, that the association was bankrupt. She proposed dissolving the HOA entirely, transferring assets to a shell company before the frivolous lawsuits drained what little remained. The notice went out Friday afternoon for a Monday morning meeting. Technically legal. Obviously a trick. She wanted it quiet, unopposed, slipped through while people were at work or dropping their kids at school. But Christine underestimated the neighborhood's appetite for drama. Word spread like wildfire. Social media posts, text chains, even Mrs. Olivia's old-fashioned phone tree mobilized the community. By Sunday night, it felt like a political rally. Monday morning, the community center parking lot overflowed. Pickup trucks, sedans, minivans, even 3 news vans with satellite dishes pointed skyward. Inside, the crowd packed every folding chair and lined the walls. The air buzzed with sweat, anticipation, and disinfectant. Christine shuffled papers at the front table, her blazer wrinkled, hair showing gray roots. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Due to mounting legal costs and harassment, she announced shakily, the board has no choice but to declare bankruptcy and dissolve this HOA. The reaction was instant. Shouts of, "Show us the books," and, "Where's the money, Christine?" ricocheted off the beige walls. The gavel in her hand clattered as she tried to restore order. That's when Jake stood up from the back row, briefcase in hand, calm as a storm before lightning. "Before this board takes any action," he said, his voice slicing through the chaos, "I have some documents that might interest everyone." He walked slowly to the front, set the papers down with a thud, and looked Christine dead in the eye. "Mrs. Cartwright, you're served." The room froze. On the table lay criminal charges, embezzlement, fraud, destruction of protected property. Civil lawsuits for damages exceeding $75,000. Federal investigations into mail fraud and racketeering. Christine's face drained of color, then flushed red, then went ghostly pale again. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Jake wasn't done. Any attempt to dissolve this HOA or transfer assets during an active federal investigation constitutes obstruction of justice. Injunctions have already been filed to prevent it. At the back of the room, the FBI agents who had quietly slipped into the crowd rose to their feet. Their presence alone silenced the last murmurs. Christine's desperate gambit had just transformed into more evidence against her. And then came the moment none of us expected. Detective Rodriguez from the county sheriff's department stepped forward, handcuffs gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Christine Cartwright," he announced, "you are under arrest for embezzlement of public funds, filing false emergency reports, and destruction of protected environmental resources." The snap of those cuffs closing around her wrists sounded sweeter than church bells. The crowd erupted. Phones flashed. Reporters shoved microphones toward Jake. Neighbors clapped, whistled, even hugged each other. And in the middle of it all, Mrs. Olivia, tiny, indomitable, high-fived 2 teenagers while clutching her evidence folder like a trophy. Christine, red-faced and trembling, was led out in cuffs. Her expensive lawyers scrambled behind her like confused puppies chasing a fire truck. The board, stripped of its dictator, voted unanimously to cooperate with investigators. The bankruptcy motion died before it could breathe. Emergency audits were scheduled for the following week. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like it belonged to us again. Christine's arrest should have been the end. Handcuffs clicked, cameras flashed, neighbors cheered. But real life doesn't tie things up with a neat little bow. If anything, her downfall only cracked open a much bigger story. She was out on bail within 48 hours. The sight of her being escorted from county jail in a wrinkled designer suit made the evening news. No more perfect blazers or polished hair, she looked like someone whose world had been ripped away piece by piece. But the wheels of justice were already grinding forward. The district attorney filed charges, embezzlement, fraud, filing false emergency reports, destruction of protected property. The FBI piled on with federal counts, mail fraud, racketeering, tax evasion. And the state board opened an inquiry into her real estate license. Christine went from clipboard queen to defendant in less than a week. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was still buzzing. Reporters camped on corners. Tourists kept flooding in for selfies with the tree. Even local businesses leaned into the chaos, bakeries selling half-tree cookies, breweries marketing chainsaw ale. For me, though, it wasn't funny. Not entirely. Every camera pointed at my yard was another reminder of what I'd lost. Every stranger leaning against the wounded trunk was another reminder of why this war had started in the first place. That oak wasn't supposed to be a circus. It was supposed to be family. 3 nights later, the city council chambers overflowed. Word had spread that the council would hear arguments on whether to officially designate my oak as a heritage tree. By 5 o'clock, the room was packed tight, residents, tourists, reporters, even out-of-town lawyers hoping to glimpse the circus. The smell of nervous sweat hung in the air, mixed with the faint scent of electrical cords overheating under too many camera lights. Christine sat in the front row, wrists still red where the cuffs had bitten. The county jail didn't offer wardrobe consultations. She wore an orange jumpsuit under a borrowed jacket that clashed horribly with her complexion. She had been released on bail that morning just in time to watch her empire collapse in front of half the county. The Historical Society presented first. A retired professor in tweed jacket and bow tie unfurled photographs dating back to 1925, my great-grandfather, fresh from France, pressing that sapling into the ground. Survey documents listed the oak as a heritage specimen. Newspaper clippings chronicled its presence through decades of community events. Even soil samples were offered as evidence of its ecological significance. This oak, the professor declared, represents more than one family's history. It embodies the agricultural heritage of this region. To destroy it is no different than vandalizing a monument. Next came the certified arborist. With charts, slides, and quiet authority, he explained how the remaining trunk could survive, even thrive, with proper care. Recovery timelines, pruning schedules, soil conditioning. He spoke of the oak as if it were a patient in recovery, not a victim of bureaucratic spite. And then the district attorney's representative rose. The words she delivered made Christine's face go ghost white. Mrs. Cartwright has been formally charged with 6 felonies, including embezzlement of HOA funds, environmental destruction, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Federal investigators have uncovered additional evidence of mail fraud and tax evasion spanning multiple years. The room went silent. You could hear the faint hum of the cameras turning to capture Christine's reaction. Her lawyer, a man with a silk tie and the expression of someone wishing he were on a beach, stared at the floor. He knew what was coming. Finally, Councilwoman Martinez leaned forward. "Mrs. Cartwright," she said crisply, "do you have anything to say in your defense?" The room collectively inhaled. Christine stood. She still carried herself with that strange mixture of arrogance and fragility, like a porcelain vase balanced on a ledge. "This is a witch hunt," she snapped, her voice rising with each word. "That tree was dangerous. I was protecting this community. These charges are political, orchestrated by outsiders who don't understand property values." She ranted for 10 minutes. Conspiracies about the media. The insurance companies. The government. She pointed at random people in the audience, accusing them of being paid agitators. The irony of a California transplant calling lifelong Arizona residents outsiders was apparently lost on her. Security guards shifted uneasily. Her lawyer buried his face in his hands. And then I stood. The clerk offered me the microphone. My legs felt heavy, my throat dry, but I knew what needed to be said. "Mrs. Cartwright," I began, my voice carrying across the chamber, "you cut down my family's 100-year-old tree while I was burying my father. You embezzled money from neighbors who trusted you. You filed false emergency reports. You terrorized this community for your own gain." I paused, locking eyes with her. She trembled with rage, or maybe fear. This was never about tree trimming or property values. This was about power. And what happens when small people get a taste of it and forget they're still accountable to the community they claim to serve? Silence stretched. 10 seconds felt like an eternity. Then someone in the back clapped. Another joined. Soon the chamber echoed with applause so thunderous the council president had to gavel for order. The vote was unanimous. Heritage tree designation approved. A protective buffer zone established. Plans for a small memorial park around the oak authorized. Christine sat slumped in her chair, the fight drained out of her. For once, her clipboard couldn't save her. Reporters swarmed me outside. How does it feel to see justice served? What's next for the tree? Any advice for homeowners fighting HOAs? I kept it simple. I learned something through all this. Bullies rely on good people staying quiet. But the moment you shine a light on them, they scatter like roaches when you flip the kitchen light. That clip played on evening broadcasts across the state. That night, I sat under the wounded oak. The sunset poured gold through its jagged branches. For the first time since Dad's funeral, I felt something like peace. This fight had never really been about compliance or fines or even the HOA. It had been about proving that one ordinary man could stand up to corruption, and win. The council's unanimous vote echoed like a bell through the neighborhood. For weeks, every conversation on the block began with, "Did you hear?" or, "Can you believe it?" The half-destroyed oak was now a heritage tree, protected by law. But protection on paper didn't erase the scars, on the tree or on us. Christine tried to act unfazed. She strutted to her SUV outside the courthouse the morning after the council vote, paparazzi-style cameras flashing. "This isn't over," she hissed at one reporter. "I will clear my name." But her walk had lost its rhythm. The sharp clip of her heels was gone, replaced with the shuffle of someone dragging invisible chains. Her downfall was everywhere. The HOA's financial audits revealed a spiderweb of shell companies, landscaping outfits that owned no mowers, consulting agencies that consulted nothing, insurance claims filed under relatives' names. Christine had siphoned money for years. Vacations, luxury cars, cosmetic surgeries, all dressed up in HOA paperwork. The HOA, once her personal fiefdom, was dismantled piece by piece. Investigators raided its storage unit, hauling out boxes of records. Lawyers froze its bank accounts. Federal agents confiscated her computers. Neighbors who once cowered now whispered openly. "She fined me $300 for a flower pot," one muttered. "Said my curtain color violated community standards," another added. Every conversation was a confessional. Christine's list of victims stretched longer than anyone had guessed. Meanwhile, life on my street took on a strange new rhythm. Tourists still came for their photos, but now they lingered longer. Local artists painted canvases of the oak's scarred trunk. A metal sculptor forged miniatures of the tree from salvaged scrap. The Henderson kids expanded their stand again, selling Oak Strong bracelets to raise money for restoration. The irony wasn't lost on me. Christine had tried to erase the tree, instead, she'd made it immortal. But the notes hadn't stopped. Same blocky handwriting. Same scratchy paper. They won't protect you forever. That tree will fall, and so will you. This time, I didn't bother showing them to Jake. He'd already warned me, Christine's cronies would stir the pot, trying to salvage what they could of her empire. But each note felt weaker, more desperate, like the dying echoes of a threat losing oxygen. The real threat was the legal grind. Jake's team filed civil claims for damages. The DA prepped criminal charges. The FBI pursued mail fraud and racketeering. Court dates stacked up like dominoes, each one threatening to topple into the next. Christine still had money, enough for high-powered attorneys who dressed better than movie stars. But money doesn't fix arrogance. At her preliminary hearing, she tried to argue with the judge. Interrupted the prosecutor. Rolled her eyes at evidence. Judges don't like that. Her bail was doubled. Her travel restricted. Her passport confiscated. The queen of clipboards was now a prisoner of the very system she had thought she controlled. One Saturday morning, Mrs. Olivia invited me to her porch for tea. Her camera system now pointed directly at my yard, not just hers. "Extra insurance," she said with a wink. "You know," she mused, stirring sugar into her mug, Christine thought she was clever. But she forgot the oldest rule: you don't go after a man's family, and you don't go after his roots. I chuckled. "Roots, huh?" She tapped her spoon. "That tree isn't just wood and leaves. It's history. People can feel it, even if they can't explain it." She tried to erase that, and people rose up. "That's why you won. Not just because you had evidence, because you had something worth defending." Her words stuck with me. That night, I sat under the oak again, looking up at the scarred branches outlined against a silver moon. For the first time, I didn't just see damage. I saw resilience. The neighborhood itself began to transform. With Christine gone, the remaining board members called for a complete reset. Special elections were scheduled. Neighbors who'd never shown interest in governance stepped forward, determined to make sure no one ever held unchecked power again. The HOA's bylaws were rewritten. Caps placed on fines. Transparency requirements added for every expenditure. Mandatory third-party audits instituted. Christine had ruled by secrecy, the new board swore by sunlight. People who had once avoided each other started talking again. Block parties returned. Kids rode bikes down streets that had once been patrolled like military zones. Porch lights flickered on later at night, not as surveillance tools, but as beacons of welcome. One evening, a group of neighbors gathered in my front yard with candles. No announcements. No agenda. Just quiet recognition. They circled the oak, lit their candles, and stood in silence. The branches swayed gently above us, scarred but alive. It felt like a funeral, a vigil, and a celebration all rolled into one. For once, I didn't feel alone in that yard. The media frenzy eventually cooled. Other scandals took the spotlight. But the story of one man versus his HOA never fully disappeared. Articles still circulated online. Documentaries sniffed around. Podcasters sent me endless requests for interviews. I declined most of them. This wasn't about fame. It wasn't about clicks. It was about my dad. Every time I walked past the oak, I heard his voice. The union electrician who taught me that knowledge was the only tool they couldn't confiscate. The man who wired this house himself, brick by brick, beam by beam. The man who'd sat on this porch with a cold beer after 12-hour shifts, staring at the oak's branches with quiet pride. The tree was him. Christine had tried to sever that connection. Instead, she'd strengthened it. The lawsuits dragged on for months. Christine's lawyers delayed, appealed, filed motions designed to exhaust us. But Jake was relentless. His team responded to every motion, countered every argument, and piled on fresh evidence at every turn. Witnesses lined up, neighbors, contractors, even former board members who had been bullied into silence. Each testified to Christine's tactics, the bogus fines, the threats, the intimidation. And then came the piece de resistance. The FBI's forensic accountants traced money through a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts. Each transfer painted the same picture: Christine siphoning HOA funds into her personal coffers. Vacations, jewelry, a condo in Florida. The jury didn't take long. Guilty. On nearly every count. When the verdict was read, Christine sat stone-faced, jaw clenched. But her hands shook, finally stripped of the illusion of control. Sentencing was scheduled for the following month. Word on the street was she'd face years in prison. The neighborhood exhaled. The war was finally ending. And me? I got to work. Arborists stabilized the oak, bracing its wounded trunk with steel cables and supports. Landscapers carefully conditioned the soil, planting companion species to help restore the ecosystem. Volunteers showed up with shovels, mulch, even handmade benches. We weren't just saving a tree. We were building a park. One Saturday, as the last bench was bolted into place, a group of kids painted a wooden sign and nailed it to the fence. The Legacy Oak. I stood back, arms crossed, a lump in my throat. Legacy. That word hit me harder than I expected. Because this was never just about roots in the ground. It was about roots in people. About what we inherit, what we defend, and what we pass forward. Christine had tried to erase a legacy. Instead, she had created one. The courthouse was packed the morning of sentencing. Reporters clustered like vultures at the steps, cameras flashing every time someone important walked in. Inside, the gallery filled with neighbors, lawyers, and curious strangers who had followed the saga online. I sat near the back, not because I wanted distance, but because I needed perspective. This fight had consumed nearly a year of my life. Every splinter of the oak, every sleepless night, every court motion and whispered threat, it had all led to this. Christine shuffled in, wrists unbound but spirit shackled. She wore a conservative suit that looked borrowed, too big in the shoulders. Her hair was flat, her makeup muted. The fire in her posture had vanished, replaced with a hollow stiffness. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with reading glasses perched low on her nose, didn't waste time. She recited the charges, the convictions, the evidence that had left little room for doubt. Embezzlement. Fraud. Destruction of protected property. Racketeering. Mail fraud. Christine's lawyer pleaded for leniency, painting her as a misguided woman who had lost her way while trying to serve her community. He spoke of her family, her reputation, her age. He argued that prison wasn't necessary, that fines and community service would suffice. When it was Christine's turn to speak, she rose shakily. For once, she didn't look like the master of the room. She looked like someone standing on the edge of a cliff with no way back. I never meant to hurt anyone, she said, voice trembling. I was protecting property values. I was trying to maintain order. Things got out of hand, yes, but I am not the monster people say I am. Her eyes flicked toward me, searching for sympathy. None came. The judge leaned forward, hands folded. Mrs. Cartwright, this court does not punish people for accidents. We punish people for choices. And you made choice after choice to enrich yourself at the expense of your neighbors. You abused trust. You abused power. And you desecrated something irreplaceable. Her gavel struck once, sharp and final. Christine Cartwright, you are hereby sentenced to 12 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 8. You are also ordered to pay $275,000 in restitution to the community and a $50,000 fine to the State Environmental Board. The room gasped. Some clapped. Others whispered furiously. Christine stood frozen, as though her mind couldn't process the weight of the words. Deputies stepped forward and cuffed her wrists. The sound of metal locking around bone echoed through the chamber. She was led away, eyes glassy, lips moving silently, maybe praying, maybe cursing. And just like that, the reign of Christine Cartwright was over. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood exhaled. With Christine behind bars, the HOA was reborn. New board members, actual volunteers, not power-hungry tyrants, stepped forward. They rewrote bylaws with transparency clauses, caps on fines, and annual audits. For the first time in years, the association felt like what it was supposed to be, neighbors helping neighbors. Block parties flourished. Kids raced bikes without fear of citations. Flags flew freely. Yards bloomed with colors Christine would have labeled unsightly. And at the center of it all stood the oak. Scarred. Braced. Alive. The city followed through on its promise. Landscapers planted flowers around the base. A small wooden fence was built to protect the roots. Benches were added beneath the canopy of surviving branches. Bronze plaques were mounted, one describing the tree's 100-year history, another commemorating the community's fight to protect it. The plaque read, "The Legacy Oak. Planted in 1925. Protected in 2023. A symbol of resilience, unity, and the power of community." People came from across the state to see it. School groups arrived on field trips. Couples took engagement photos under its twisted branches. Artists sketched, painted, sculpted. What Christine had tried to erase had become a monument. For me, though, the oak was more than a symbol. It was a mirror. Every night, I sat beneath its canopy with a cold beer, the same way Dad used to. I stared up at the jagged silhouette against the stars and felt his presence. I thought of the lessons he'd drilled into me: fight for what matters, stand your ground, never let someone with a clipboard or a badge of false authority take away your dignity. The fight had cost me months of stress. Thousands in legal fees. Friends who had turned their backs when things got ugly. Nights haunted by anonymous threats and the sound of chainsaws. But it had also given me something back. A community that stood tall. A legacy secured. A reminder that even ordinary people can face giants and win. Sometimes I wondered if Dad would have been proud. Then the wind would rush through the oak's battered branches, carrying a sound that felt like an answer. The story spread further than I expected. News outlets across the country picked it up. Podcasts dissected every detail. Documentaries pitched me for interviews. Law schools reached out, asking if they could use the case in coursework about HOA overreach. Even state legislators took notice. Bills were drafted proposing stricter limits on HOA powers, citing my case as Exhibit A. I hadn't set out to be a symbol. I was just a son trying to protect his father's legacy. But sometimes, symbols choose you. And the oak, scarred, stubborn, standing, became one for everyone. The last time I visited Christine was by accident. I was driving past the county jail to a job site when I saw her in the yard, orange jumpsuit blazing in the sun. She was raking gravel with a group of inmates. The once proud posture was gone. She moved slowly, shoulders hunched, eyes on the ground. For a moment, our gazes almost met. I couldn't tell if she recognized me, but I didn't stop. I didn't need revenge anymore. The system had taken care of her. The oak was alive. The legacy was safe. And me? I had work to do, wires to run, homes to light, and a tree to sit under when the day was done. The neighborhood looked different in the months after Christine's sentencing. Not in its streets or houses, those were the same beige boxes and cul-de-sacs they'd always been, but in the atmosphere. Where once there had been suspicion, clipped greetings, and the ever-present shadow of Christine's rule, now there was warmth. Neighbors lingered at the mailbox, sharing stories instead of complaints. Kids chalked the sidewalks without fear of violations. Flags, wind chimes, bird feeders, porch swings, all the little personal touches Christine had once outlawed, returned like spring blossoms after a long frost. For the first time since Dad passed, I could walk outside without feeling a knot in my chest. The oak stood at the center of it all. Its scarred trunk was bound with steel supports, its roots cushioned by fresh mulch, its base surrounded by flowers planted by volunteers. The benches beneath it were rarely empty. Couples sat holding hands. Old-timers swapped stories. Children climbed the low branches that Christine had once called hazardous. The tree was no longer just mine. It belonged to all of us. And I realized that was how it should be. Work picked up too. The media attention had painted me as the man who beat the HOA. At first, I worried that would scare clients off. Instead, it brought them in. "I saw you on the news," one contractor said, clapping me on the back. Anyone who stands up to that kind of nonsense is the kind of guy I want wiring my projects. I booked more jobs than I could handle alone. Soon, I hired 2 apprentices. Teaching them the trade felt like paying forward what Dad had given me. Every conduit I bent, every breaker I wired, carried his lessons. One evening, after a long day running wires through a new housing development, I sat under the oak with my apprentices. They asked about the trial, the council meeting, the tree's designation. I told them the story, not for my sake, but for theirs. Remember, I said, there will always be people who think they can bully their way through life. But every system, every board, every law, it only works if people stand up. Sometimes all it takes is one person saying no. They listened quietly, and I hoped the words would stick the way my dad's had stuck with me. But closure wasn't instant. Some nights I still woke with the sound of chainsaws buzzing in my ears. I'd sit up in bed, heart racing, half expecting to see fresh sawdust outside my window. The notes, though they had stopped arriving, haunted me in memory. Drop it or lose more than a tree. Grief is like that. It lingers. It doesn't follow court calendars or council votes. One evening, I found myself walking the perimeter of the oak like a guard. Moonlight cast long shadows across the grass. The scars in the trunk glowed pale, almost silver. For a moment, I wondered if Christine had been right about one thing: maybe the tree was dangerous, maybe it was doomed, maybe I'd fought for something already lost. And then a breeze rushed through the branches, carrying the sound of leaves rustling, a sound I hadn't heard since before the chainsaws. It was softer now, weaker, but it was there. I closed my eyes and smiled. No, the oak wasn't doomed. It was scarred, yes. But it was alive. And as long as it was alive, it would stand. Spring came. The legacy oak sprouted new shoots. Tiny leaves unfurled from the branches Christine hadn't reached. Kids called it a comeback. The arborists called it resilience. I called it proof. The community hosted its first official Oak Festival. Food trucks lined the street. Musicians played under the branches. Local artists displayed paintings, sculptures, jewelry inspired by the tree. Proceeds went toward a neighborhood improvement fund, with part reserved for the oak's care. Standing in the crowd, watching neighbors laugh and dance where once they had tiptoed under Christine's surveillance, I felt something loosen in my chest. The oak hadn't just survived. It had given us back our neighborhood. Christine faded into the background. Her appeals failed. Her name became a punchline whispered at block parties. Occasionally, reporters asked if I'd like to comment on her prison life. I always declined. She wasn't my story anymore. The oak was. Mrs. Olivia kept her watchful eye, though. Old habits die hard, she'd say, pointing to her cameras. But her tone had softened. She wasn't on high alert anymore. She was simply vigilant, the way a grandmother keeps cookies in a jar, just in case company comes by. One afternoon, she handed me a small box. Inside was the USB drive she'd first given me, the footage of Christine measuring the oak before filing her bogus emergency order. "You keep it now," she said. "History belongs to those who lived it." I tucked it into my desk drawer, not because I needed evidence anymore, but because it reminded me of the moment everything turned. The moment one neighbor's courage sparked a fight worth finishing. Months later, the city unveiled a permanent installation, a bronze sculpture of the oak's scarred trunk, placed near the council chambers. A plaque beneath it read, "Dedicated to those who stand against corruption." May this remind us that even scarred things can remain strong. I stood there during the unveiling, hat in hand, watching strangers admire it. Some took photos. Some just stared quietly. It hit me then, this wasn't just about my father anymore. Or my family. Or even the neighborhood. The oak had become something larger, a symbol of dignity, defiance, and the power of ordinary people to fight back. And maybe that was the real legacy. One night, long after the festival crowd had gone home, I sat alone under the oak. The moonlight painted silver across its bark. I rested my hand on the trunk and whispered, "We made it, Dad." For a moment, I swore I could hear his laugh in the wind. I leaned back on the bench, closed my eyes, and let the rustle of leaves carry me. Not just the leaves of a tree, but the echoes of everything we'd fought for, roots that ran deeper than soil, branches that reached farther than wood. And for the first time since the chainsaws roared, I felt whole. A year passed before I truly felt the weight of everything settle. 12 months since the chainsaws had roared. 12 months since Christine had been paraded in cuffs through the community center. 12 months since the oak had gone from victim to symbol. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest scars. The shredded trunk, once jagged and raw, now wore its wounds like a badge. New shoots sprouted defiantly from the surviving branches. Spring leaves unfurled in bursts of green. Each season layered another coat of resilience over the damage. The legacy oak wasn't just surviving. It was thriving. And so was the neighborhood. The HOA, reborn from Christine's ashes, became something closer to what Dad always said communities should be. Transparent. Accountable. Human. Meetings shifted from finger-pointing tribunals to problem-solving gatherings. Neighbors actually showed up, not out of fear, but out of investment. One Saturday, the board organized a community build day. Instead of fines for unsightly lawns, volunteers mowed yards for elderly residents. Instead of violation notices for chipped paint, we painted houses together, brushes and laughter mixing in the air. Kids set up lemonade stands, not as rogue businesses to be shut down, but as part of the event. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt alive. And every time I saw a kid climb onto a bench under the oak, every time I watched neighbors linger in conversation instead of rushing inside to avoid Christine's glare, I realized this was more than recovery. This was rebirth. But the oak's influence stretched far beyond our block. The city used the case as a template for reform. HOA oversight laws tightened. Property owners gained new rights. State representatives pushed for legislation limiting the reach of HOA boards, citing the Legacy Oak case as proof of what happens when power goes unchecked. Reporters still called from time to time. Law schools wanted transcripts. Even documentary crews circled, sniffing for rights. I turned down most of them. The story had already been told, in courtrooms, council chambers, and the soil under my father's tree. But occasionally, I'd agree, not to bask in the spotlight, but to remind people that ordinary homeowners had a voice. One interview stuck with me. The reporter asked, "What gave you the strength to keep fighting when it seemed like the whole system was stacked against you?" I thought of Dad. Of Mrs. Olivia with her camera footage. Of Jake, calm and relentless in court. Of kids selling bracelets to save the tree. "It wasn't me," I said. "It was all of us. One person can stand up, sure. But it only works if others stand with you." Christine lost because she underestimated that. She thought power meant control. But real power comes from community. That quote ran in papers across the state. It didn't feel like wisdom to me. Just truth. Life at home settled into a rhythm again. My business grew. The apprentices I'd hired became journeymen, running their own projects under my guidance. Clients valued not just the work, but the story. "If you fought the HOA," one woman said, "I know you'll fight for my job too." Some nights, I sat under the oak with my crew after a long day, telling them the story of the fight. They laughed at parts, shook their heads at others. But when I spoke about the chainsaws, the threats, the council vote, they went quiet. "You kept standing," one of them said softly. I nodded. Because if you sit down when someone like Christine comes at you, you'll never stand again. There were still scars. Christine filed appeals from prison, each one tossed aside like paper airplanes. But the motion stirred memories. The notes. The nights I'd walked my yard like a sentry. The funeral day, when I'd come home from burying Dad only to find half his tree gone. Those wounds didn't vanish. They lived in me like echoes. But echoes fade. And the sound of kids laughing under the oak drowned them out more each day. The oak festivals became tradition. Every spring, the neighborhood threw a block party in its honor. Food trucks. Music. Art exhibits. Kids painting murals on the sidewalk. The oak, scarred but strong, became the stage and the symbol. This year, a group of local veterans built a flagpole near the benches, dedicating it to the fight for dignity at home. The flag rose against the sky, the oak's branches framing it like open arms. Standing there, hand over heart during the anthem, I felt tears sting my eyes. Not from grief this time, but from pride. We had taken something broken and made it whole again, not perfect, but stronger in its imperfection. I visited Dad's grave that evening, a tradition I'd neglected in the chaos of trials and hearings. The cemetery was quiet, the air heavy with the smell of fresh-cut grass. I knelt by his headstone, brushed away stray leaves, and set down a small branch trimmed from the oak during its recovery. "We did it," I whispered. "The tree's still here. Strong as ever. And so is everything you taught me." I sat in silence, listening to the wind in the distance. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was talking to a memory. I felt like I was talking to him. The oak will outlive me. Of that, I'm certain. Its roots run deep, its branches stretch wide, its scars now part of its story. Someday, kids who aren't even born yet will sit beneath it, not knowing my name or Christine's, but feeling the quiet strength of survival. And that's enough. Because this was never about winning against one woman. It was about proving that dignity, once challenged, can't be sawed down. It can be scarred, yes. Bruised, broken, battered. But it rises again, like new shoots in spring. The oak taught me that. My father taught me that. And now, I carry it forward. Time has a way of sanding down sharp edges. 2 years after the chainsaws tore through my oak, the neighborhood no longer spoke of Christine in whispers or shouts. She was a ghost now, a name remembered only when someone muttered, "Can you believe we let her run things?" Her old house sat unsold, weeds pushing through the cracks of the driveway. Realtors called it a fixer-upper with history. Buyers steered clear. Nobody wanted to inherit her shadow. But the oak. The oak was alive. Its branches, once jagged stumps, now reached skyward again, clothed in fresh leaves. The steel supports had been removed. The arborists declared it stable. Children still called it the comeback tree, climbing its lower branches like they were playground equipment. Couples carved initials into the bench beneath it. Tourists stopped less frequently now, but when they did, it wasn't for spectacle. It was reverence. The legacy oak had grown past its wounds. And so had we. Life carried forward. My apprentices became journeymen, then masters of their own crews. Watching them succeed felt like watching branches stretch farther than I ever could. Dad would have been proud, not of the money or the contracts, but of the craft passed down, one set of calloused hands to another. The neighborhood flourished. Annual oak festivals became as expected as 4th of July parades. The new HOA board, stripped of arrogance and filled with actual volunteers, became a model for other communities. Universities studied it. Legislators cited it. And in the center of it all, the oak stood, a scarred monument to what happens when ordinary people refuse to bow. Sometimes I still thought of Christine. Not out of bitterness, but curiosity. She was serving her sentence quietly. No more interviews. No more press. Her name didn't trend online anymore. She was just another inmate in a system that chews people up and spits them out. I wondered if she ever thought of the oak. If she lay awake at night, replaying the moment the chainsaws roared, realizing that what she meant as destruction had become a symbol far bigger than her reach. Maybe she did. Maybe she didn't. Either way, it didn't matter. She was gone. And we were still here. Closure came slowly, not in one dramatic moment, but in small ones. The day I stopped waking at night to phantom chainsaws. The first time I noticed the oak's leaves rustle without remembering the cuts. The morning I walked past the trunk and realized I felt pride, not pain. One afternoon, I brought a lawn chair under the oak and sat with a notebook. I wasn't writing motions or complaints or timelines. I was writing stories, memories Dad had told me. About his first job as a union apprentice. About wiring the very house I still lived in. About the day he and Mom danced in the yard, music blasting from a radio balanced on the porch railing. The oak had been there through all of it. Silent. Watching. Rooted. And now it watched me, pen scratching paper, finally free of battles. The last piece of closure came unexpectedly. The city invited me to speak at a dedication ceremony. They were naming the park that now surrounded the oak. It wasn't just my yard anymore, the community had pooled resources, bought the adjoining lot and turned it into green space for everyone. When the day came, I stood on a small stage, microphone in hand, the oak rising behind me like a guardian. Neighbors filled the grass, kids running between picnic blankets, reporters tucked at the edges. The mayor introduced me as the man who defended dignity. I shook my head at that. I wasn't a hero. I was just stubborn. But I spoke anyway. This tree isn't just wood and leaves, I said. It's proof. Proof that when people stand together, even against something that seems bigger than them, they can win. Proof that scars don't mean the end. They mean survival. I paused, letting the wind move through the branches. My father planted this tree almost 100 years ago. He taught me that knowledge was the only tool they couldn't take from you. I didn't understand what he meant back then. But I do now. Because this tree isn't just his legacy. It's ours. All of ours. And it will stand long after we're gone. Applause rolled across the park. Children cheered. And I felt something uncoil inside me, something I hadn't even realized I'd been holding. It was done. Truly done. That night, I sat beneath the oak one last time as just mine. Tomorrow it would belong fully to the community, a park, a landmark, a shared treasure. But tonight, it was still the same tree I'd grown up under, the same branches that had shaded my father, the same roots that had anchored my childhood. I rested my hand on the bark, rough and scarred, and whispered, "We made it." The leaves rustled in reply, soft and steady, like an old friend breathing. And for the first time in years, I felt not just peace, but joy.